a grouping of ponderous, football-sized rocks, now located on private property, 30 minutes due east of Monument, Colorado, mark the very lonely and forgotten remains of Mr. Michael Fagan, a contracted employee of the United States Army, who froze to miserable death 100 yards from his coworkers during a freak 60-hour snowstorm in May of 1858. Today his plot has an Elbert, Colorado address. Back when, they called it Point of Rocks, a stopping place along the Cherokee Trail, which hooked up with the Trapper Trail, connecting New Mexico to California, Oregon, the forts, or the states. While Mr. Fagan's final resting place is quite private today, and some might argue it's very lonely, he didn't arrive at the happy hunting grounds alone that night. Another civilian teamster mysteriously burned to death during the snowstorm. In addition to the 2 human losses, hundreds of other animals, a combination of sheep, cattle, mules, oxen, horses, and even confused antelope, left this realm, perhaps guided on by the 2 men into the vast and pristine pastures of the next world, somewhere far away, out of the cold, to run, leap, and live free again. And why were all these sheep and people way out in the middle of nowhere during a snowstorm in May? The answer? Bad damned luck. While buffalo roamed. The Wild Western Days of Colorado, Episode 4. General William Larimer, Jr. shuddered when he saw snow beginning to accumulate on the trail in November of 1858, on his way to Cherry Creek. He recalled Marcy's disaster that occurred earlier in the year, and he had to question his sanity as he passed over and around the bones of hundreds of scattered, grotesque, rotted animals near Point of Rocks, Kansas Territory. He knew what had happened on this ground just 5.5 months ago. It was in all the newspapers, and here it was November. We just got to keep moving, he thought. Rewind about a year, November of 1857. Captain Randolph Marcy is about to embark on a march from Camp Scott in Utah Territory, 350 miles west of Fort Laramie, near Fort Bridger, in the lower western corner of today Wyoming. November would be a dangerous time of year to walk more than the entire latitude of the current state of Colorado. But orders are orders, and Captain Marcy was ordered by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston to take a party south to New Mexico and get more animals. Yes, animals. In the autumn of 1857, there was Mormon trouble again. In short, Brigham Young just wanted his world in Utah to be left alone. President Buchanan wanted all that tough talking stopped, and fresh off the heels of the Mountain Meadows Massacre and with an angry public, the Utah War or the Mormon War results, and the name might be a little stronger than needed, but it caused a force of 2,500 troops to travel from Leavenworth, Kansas Territory to Camp Scott near Fort Bridger, ordered by President Buchanan. The ultimate goal was to get Alfred Cumming in as governor of the Utah Territory and restore order. Brigham Young, acting governor, was making threats and logistical trouble with the U.S. Army, not engaging in military offenses per se, but threatening war against the states and interfering with the Army's animals and wagon trains, kind of a tactic frequently used by the people. Colonel Sidney Johnston took control of the movement westward from Fort Leavenworth, and moving the said forces, it was well understood that winter was approaching. And knowing they would be at camp for an indeterminable amount of time, Johnston felt they would need more animals, for the journey from the states had depleted much of their living provisions and work implements. Colonel Johnston, by all accounts, a fine leader, very organized, able to see problems coming, highly regarded and handpicked for the Utah detail, for a steady hand was needed to keep a couple thousand people in camp during a Wyoming winter. He would later be the highest-ranking officer killed in action during the Civil War, early at Shiloh. Johnston put a garrison within the remaining walls of Fort Bridger, which the Mormons had just burned out and abandoned, and a mile away the remaining force waited, or lived, at Camp Scott for the opportunity to confront the Mormons. Johnston then orders Captain Randolph Barnes Marcy to head south to New Mexico and buy mules, horses, cows, and sheep, then bring them back to Camp Scott. Randolph Marcy, a Massachusetts native and West Point grad, medium build, with burn sides, that's a mustache that travels along the jawline, with a clean chin. He was a captain in the Mexican War and explorer of the Texas Panhandle. Marcy departed Camp Scott on November 27th, leading a group of 40 enlisted men and 22 civilians, all provisions and gear packed on 65 mules. Their destination, Fort Union, southeast of Taos, New Mexico. 700 miles away the way they did it. Marcy thought it would take 25 days, and to be safe, he ordered up 30 days' worth of provisions to be packed. The group left Utah Territory in good weather. The route, southeastern. Most of the trip would have been views like you might see around Moab, eastern Utah, and western Colorado, with deep gorges, oranges, reds, and greens in the wind-finished rock formations, mesas. They probably entered western Colorado near the Grand Junction area and kept southwest. Everything went smoothly until 24 days in. Now remember, Marcy thought the whole trip would take 25 days. So, 24 days in, they start hitting real Colorado mountains and heavy snow. It's winter in the Rockies. Side note, my nephew and his pal visited me back in December of this year, bringing with them all kinds of modern equipment used for camping and hiking during winter. They claimed they were in training. I had to ask what some of the stuff was, actually. They aimed to camp for a week among the 14,000-foot peaks nearby. One of the two succumbed to altitude sickness on day 2 and spent half the week in a warm bed watching movies. The other did summit a 14er. It took him 17 hours on a sunny day. The snow was only 9 inches deep on the trail. In summer, that hike would take about 4 hours if you were going very slow. To their credit, the boys did camp one night in our yard. One night. On that evening, there were wind speeds of over 60 miles an hour and a feels-like temperature of -14. End of side note. By September 27th, it was obvious to Marcy that provisions could not possibly last. Their mules were starting to give out. They were in a very dangerous situation. That night, Marcy decides to send an express out to their layover destination, which was Fort Massachusetts, on the east side of the San Luis Valley, a little south of the great sand dunes of southern Colorado. The next morning, Miguel Alina and Mariano Medina set out with 3 of the best mules. The rest of the group followed their tracks until the snow covered them. The express team plunged along. It was slow going. New Year's Day they made 2 miles. The snow was so deep the men had to crawl on all fours to keep from sinking to their necks. And worse than that, they used up all their provisions and would have to depend on worn-out animals for food. The first was a colt that belonged to Tim Gooddale's wife, a native woman, who cried and carried on bitterly, the animal having always been her pet. Next was another horse that could not continue. Then they started on the remains of the mules for the next week and a half. They get 3 miles one day, 5 miles the next. They toiled up and down the snow-covered mountains. Side note, Marcy only loses 1 man on that leg of the trip, but a lot of animals never made it to New Mexico after their provisions were exhausted, which happens fast when you trudge through snow over 3 feet high. Last year here in Gilpin County, we got a storm that left 5 feet of snow on the floor. My dog Chewy and I charged through that mess to check on a neighbor. Animals don't do much when the snow is over their heads by the tune of several feet, and neither do people. To just move 20 feet in that much snow is exhausting, and that's new snow. Marcy's troop was trying to plow through old and new snow. Very, very tough. The old snow makes a hard crust that can sometimes support a man's weight for a few steps, then suddenly drops you. And finding/taking that tall step is demoralizing without snowshoes, or food, or a shovel, or food. They had to make a trail out of solid old and new snow 5 to 8 feet high at times. 200 miles of that. End of side note. The Marcy expedition kept on through an angry, frozen, wind-whipped wilderness, unforgiving and cold. And according to Marcy, the men, who by the way volunteered for this mission, did not utter a discouraging word. Feats of human endurance, group survival in freezing weather come to mind. And while Marcy's expedition is unknown to most people, it ranks right up there with tragic situations such as the Donner Reed Party of 1846 and the Uruguayan Flight 571 that crashed in the Andes Mountains in 1972, the survivors enduring for 72 days, resorting to eating their own. At last, the starving and freezing group crested the last mountain, and the valley that they sought came into view, but with no sight of the express team. After descending the last mountain, they found grass coming through the snow, a gift, and they stayed there a couple days to regroup and let the animals eat. On January 12th, one of the men saw 2 riders in the distance. Soon it was apparent their saviors had reached the fort and were returning. A couple wagons with supplies were 50 miles behind them and were ordered to drive night and day to reach the beleaguered caravan. By the time Marcy's group made it to Fort Massachusetts, they were in very rough shape. A quote from Marcy: "Not more than half the men had any caps, and a few had any remains of trousers below the knees. Their feet were tied up with mule hides, pieces of blankets, coat tails, etc. As for myself, I am confident my own wife would not have recognized me." End quote. 51 days on that march. Marcy said he started at 170 pounds and ended at 130 pounds. He wrote that for 200 miles of the trip there were between 2 and 5 feet of snow on the ground. There was one fatality, Sergeant William Morton, a, quote, "most excellent soldier," end quote, who succumbed to exposure and imprudence in eating. That's a quote. Not sure what that means, unless he wouldn't eat horse or mule. Well, perhaps the rumors were true that the animals were eaten raw, and he wouldn't do it. But what about Fagan and the lonely grave in Elbert, Colorado? All of that happened on the return trip to Camp Scott. On March 18th, Marcy's command headed back north with 30 wagons and over 1,000 horses and mules. This time they would avoid the mountains and take the Trapper Road north. They stopped at Pueblo, then camped near Pikes Peak for almost a month waiting for Colonel William Loring and his 200-some-odd men. They were to be reinforcements to protect Marcy's group from the Mormons. There was a threat. It turned out to be unfounded. Marcy's men and all the horses and all the animals were out in front of Loring, and they started up or north on the Cherokee Trail ahead of Loring's infantry. Now Loring and his men overtook Marcy's team and were ahead of them by maybe 6 miles when, on April 29th, a terrible snowstorm rolled in from the mountains on what was otherwise a beautiful, pleasant day. This was no ordinary storm either. Number one, it was the end of April, almost May. Number two, it lasted 60 hours. Non-stop snow for 60 hours is a situation anywhere. And this is right about when all the animals from both camps decided to take off. They stampeded. They just ran for their lives. Cattle, mules, oxen, and sheep, their handlers busy trying to stay alive themselves. But there was no stopping so many freaked out animals. A quote from Loring. When its violence somewhat abated, the cold and violence of the wind was so great that human life was in constant peril. A civilian teamster and the quartermaster's employee was frozen to death, and several hundred sheep perished in the storm. A large number of horses and cattle belonging to citizens traveling with the command also perished. A number of mules broke through control and fled before the storm, many as far as 60 miles. The entire number, with the few exceptions, were recovered. Marcy, whose herds were 7 miles back, used every exertion to save them. In the fury of the storm, 300 of his mules fled in the same manner as our camp. They also, with few exceptions, were finally recovered. Both camps were badly frostbitten and otherwise injured. The snow on the level was 2.5 to 3 feet deep, and when drifted, 15 to 20 feet. The antelope of the prairie were frozen to death, numbers of them in our immediate vicinity, mixing among our sheep for protection and perishing with them." End quote. A quote from Marcy. Of 3 Mexican herdsmen who followed them, one perished from the cold, actually freezing to death, and another was found crawling over the prairie after the storm ceased, in a state of temporary insanity with his limbs badly frozen. He was brought to camp and subsequently recovered. Another man perished 200 yards from the camp, and the charred remains of a fourth were found where a fire had been built. With the flesh entirely burned off, it was supposed that the latter had lain by the fire when so chilled and so benumbed to be helpless, and that in this condition he actually fell into the flames, from what he could not extricate himself. The deceased were all New Mexicans. After the storm subsided, the stampeded animals were found scattered over the country on the Arkansas, but nearly all of them were recovered. Quote from 2nd Lieutenant John Van Dusen Du Bois. "During the night of April 30th, the tent came down. As the snow drifted on it, its weight became unsupportable to those under it, and after attempting unsuccessfully to obtain relief, the doctor was forced to upset Loring's cot, and by rolling him off his cot supported the tent high enough for breath. Not a soldier was visible. All our stock had stampeded. Nothing was left in camp but McRae's horses. All day it snowed. At night I slept in McRae's tent. We could not sleep. It was so cold. We drank 4 quarts of liquor during the day when we were in the snow without feeling any effect. During the night, we heard cries and opening our tent to 2 Mexicans who stumbled in almost dead. Their limbs and faces were completely frozen. One had carried the other for 1.5 miles, and being lost in the drifting snow, our light had saved their lives. We rubbed their limbs and gave them blankets, and in 2 hours they were almost comfortable. The dead man was within 100 yards of our tent, frozen to death." End quote. An account was made of the animals dead, and this is from both camps. 350 sheep, 10 horses, 300 mules, 75 head of cattle. I don't even know if I've seen that many animals. That's a heavy loss for a May snowstorm. And just what are the odds of a spring snowstorm where one man freezes to death and another burns? Marcy claims 4 dead and describes 3, the 4th probably Sergeant Morton from the first leg of the journey. The grave of Michael Fagan is still visible. It's out there, on private property, on the west bank of West Kiowa Creek, Elbert, Colorado. 5 months after Fagan's death, gold seekers passed by his gravesite on the Cherokee Trail, en route to the mouth of Cherry Creek. Fagan's grave was dug shallow, his body covered with rocks, then soil on top. There was a wooden cross with inscription. The exact phrase and name are in slight debate, but the last name of Fagan is universally agreed upon, and most accounts accept Michael as the first name. Surrounding his tomb, in all directions, was a hideous scene. Tortured remains in discord. Undeniable evidence of a desperate event. The Marcy loring expedition continued on without great trouble after that storm. They stopped at the future site of Denver for a couple days, and from there headed northwest. By the time they arrived at Camp Scott, Brigham Young and the feds had reached a deal. A pardon was accepted, and the new governor, Cumming, was in place. Meaning, at the very least, that the trip was not urgent, and at worst, a waste. Loring marched in on a vacant Salt Lake City, as Brigham Young might have been thinking relocation, and we will hear more from Captain Randolph Marcy. Did Michael Fagan die for nothing? No. He was at work. He and everybody else were working. A 30-day camping ride, or walk, probably. It paid good enough for him to do it. He was most likely looking for an animal in his charge, a horse or ox, and he almost made it. One weird storm. And here we are today, his monument evidence of the famous Marcy Loring March, a marker of interest, a story of perseverance, hidden beside an ancient creek next to Point of Rocks on the old Cherokee Trail. End note. The Marcy party was at the confluence of Cherry Creek at the South Platte in the first week of May of 1858. And while waiting for 75 wagons to be ferried across the swollen Platte, a teamster showed Marcy a quantity of fine gold dust that he had recovered from the creek's brown sands. A few weeks later, that unknown civilian teamster is discharged from his duty, arrives in St. Louis, and spreads the word that there's gold out that way in West Kansas Territory, near Pikes Peak. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful week and a very safe weekend. And tune in next time. We're going to find gold and meet General William Larimer Jr. while the buffalo roamed. Bye now, and thanks again. J.B. Reynolds, copyright 2025.